Dead by Daylight has almost been out for 10 years now. We're going strong on currently year 10, and we're somewhat closing in towards the 10th year anniversary, which is an amazing achievement, honestly, that so many of us are still here after all this time. Today, I wanted to discuss some of the older killers and start going up from there. This is going to be a series. Some of the killers that have been here since the very beginning, since the alpha or the beta, and the beginning of the game have been Trapper, Hillbilly, and the Wraith. We all know them as they were the first 3 killers to release when the game first came out on June 14th. But today, I wanted to put our focus on the Trapper. Now, Trapper has gone through a lot over the course of these 9 years and then some. There have been a huge amount of issues with Trapper, some of which that have been improved upon, some of which that I feel like could still use some work. And overall, unfortunately, Trapper is currently in a place where he unfortunately lacks what a lot of other killers have. So currently, in my opinion, as well as many other people's opinion, he is most likely the very bottom of the tier list alongside some other killers like Myers. And today in this video, I wanted to discuss everything there basically is to know about Trapper, what he currently is in the current meta, what he has been like, what kind of changes has he gone through and how have they helped him, and also what he could be. Keep in mind though that Behavior has stated in a recent Reddit Q&A that they are looking into Trapper and giving him some well-needed updates. So some of these changes might not have a lot of weight eventually when they do announce what updates they have planned for Trapper, but for now I still wanted to make this video as Dead by Daylight is a huge passion for me, always has been, and I feel like for a very long time still will be. So throughout this video, we're going to have 3 sections of the video, and they are all going to be timestamped. For those of you who are only interested in a specific part of the video, which is completely understandable. And so we will be going through, as you can see from the image right now, we will be going through the strengths and weaknesses, really discussing what Trapper is actually good at, and also other things he might fall behind in. We will also be discussing what changes he'd had. This is going to be a smaller section. We will discuss relatively briefly what changes he's gotten, what kind of buffs and nerfs has he received, all those kind of stuff. Otherwise, that section will be relatively short, but I feel like it's still nice to talk about just to know a little bit more about Trapper's history in this game. And the biggest section of this video will be me discussing a rework me and along with a few of my friends have been thinking about, have been brainstorming a little bit, and I feel like we've gotten into a pretty good idea of what a rework for Trapper could honestly look like. I'm really excited to talk about that later on in this video. So let's get started right into the first section of the video, which again is his strengths and weaknesses. Trapper has always been, unfortunately, extremely map dependent. There are a lot of maps he struggles in, a few maps he's okay in, and then there's also, surprisingly enough, a fair few maps that allow him to really showcase his power. This mostly is to do with the amount of grass that is found on a lot of those maps that he's good at. Fortunately, also very prominent that in the maps he's bad at, there's usually not a lot of places you can hide your traps in, and usually the trap spots are very predictable. So I wanted to very quickly show you guys a quick graph, and this is like a basic idea of like the tiers of maps that he might struggle. And I've set a few examples of images on each of them, so let's get into it. Some maps that could be considered awful for Trapper is something like Eyrie of Crows, unfortunately, because there are no good spots to conceal your traps in, so survivors will always see where they are as long as they are looking at the ground while being chased or while not being chased. And they're usually going to be quite predictable, so there's not much you can really do. And also, a map like Eyrie of Crows favors Shift plus W very heavily for survivors. Shift plus W basically means just like holding run away from loops while, Trapper's setting up a trap or trying to mind game. Because he struggles with that a lot because, again, he's a mouse one killer. He has no ability to really catch up with you other than the built-in haste that he gets after setting a trap. And also, on a map like this, it's very easy to pre-run from Trapper, which kind of goes into the same category as Shift as W. You hear Trapper's terror radius, you start running immediately, and by the time Trapper has gotten to the gen you're on, or whatever you're doing, boom, you are so far away, and more often than not, you can pretty easily reach points of interest like Shack, or as just a really good loop that he can't really close out with traps either. Now, some decent maps that are a lot better than Area of Crows, but also not the best still either, is a map, for example, like Coal Tower. There are honestly some pretty good spots for concealing your traps and all that. There's also, you are able to close off some very strong loops with your traps. For example, the main building in Coal Tower. If you don't want to break the walls in main building and instead just trap the window from outside or inside if you're crazy, but mind that your trap's not going to be really concealed at that point, that's actually pretty good value because a lot of players in Coal Tower like to hover towards main, especially if gens around that place have already been on, because obviously good and experienced survivors will try to bring you towards an area where generators have already been completed or where people are not fixing gens at the current time. A lot of tiles in maps like these, such as Coal Tower and many others, there's many maps. All of Macmillan Estate maps are basically in the decent area, in my opinion. Those tiles allow for good pressure from Trapper, and he can kind of play around them. Despite the fact that survivors are still somewhat able to pre-run against Trapper on maps like this, he is able to put out a little more pressure, for example, like putting survivors in the worst part of a window or the worst side of a pallet, so that even if they do pre-run, their position isn't the best and they may not necessarily be able to make it to as many places as they'd want it to. Now, speaking of really good maps, of course, these are all personal opinions, but I think one of the really good maps that Trapper excels in is a map like Dead Dog Saloon. Dead Dog Saloon has probably one of the most thick grass in the whole game, which again is just gonna show obviously why he's going to be really good in it. There's also a lot of random bushes and stuff like that it can conceal traps in. So survivors really need to watch their step when they're looping basically anywhere. Behind houses in Dead Dog Saloon is going to be dangerous. Looping at main will be dangerous. Even though you can't really conceal your traps in main, it'll still be really dangerous. Because again, if he just doesn't break the wall by the window and then places a trap there, it's going to be really hard for survivors to make the most of it. Another point is that sometimes Swift can be an issue for that. But regardless, Dead Dog is an amazing map for him. Because again, there are a lot of tiles as well that this is a trap in, and survivor is forced to go to another spot in the map, to another tile. And he can kind of just keep doing that until he manages to zone you into a corner of the map, or just a bad enough position for you to take advantage of. Rerunning in these kinds of maps, like Dead Dog Saloon, especially regarding the size, is pretty risky actually. Because if you, as a survivor, you don't have a perk like Bond or other aura reading perks, you run a risk of running to other survivors that are fixing a generator. Because it's very prominent in maps, especially like Dead Dog Saloon, that if you fix even one or two wrong generators, the generator split of the map, when there's only like 3 or 4 generators remaining, might be so harsh that killers like Trapper will like really benefit from just being able to defend the 3-gen. So it's really risky sometimes to pre-run in maps like that because of their size. Now, in regards to Trapper's placement in the current meta and where he is on the tier list, I wanted to have a little talk about that as well. Currently, you know, if we take a look at the tier list at this very moment in time, this may not be fully accurate, as some of these might be a little dated, but I've made a small graph here, as you can see. Just a general idea of the current tier list and what you can kind of expect from killers in 2025. So first we have the S tier killers, and to many, if not all, it is very obvious that still at the S tier stands Nurse and Blight, because they are the most lethal killers in the game that have a very good power that allows them to apply so much pressure and also down survivors so reliably fast that like it makes it very difficult for survivors to deal with. Now moving on to B tier killers. They are examples such as Dredge and Nemesis. They tend to oftentimes lack some kind of mobility power to be able to cover ground fast. Exceptions are some killers like Dredge though, because they have the teleportation ability. But these sorts of B tier killers more often than not tend to at least have an ability that usually aids them a lot in chase, you know, like anti-loop kind of powers, you know. For example, with Nemesis, he's able to hit people over pallets, over windows, stuff like that. So that really does help him. And the better players can really display a lot of skill with killers like that. And then we are moving to D tier killers, which are notoriously some of the weakest killers in the game, without a doubt. Killers like Myers and Trapper, like we are discussing of Trapper in this video, they usually have in common that a lot of the add-ons don't necessarily really help them, or the fact that some of the add-ons that those killers have almost feel like a necessity to run for you to be able to get any kind of result, or to have a chance to have any kind of result during those matches. They, more often than not, also tend to have a very poor chase power. You know, exactly like with Trapper. Trapper doesn't exactly have a chase power. He just puts his traps down, and survivors can counter that pretty easily. Killers like Myers have tier 3, which allows them to vault windows faster, which definitely does help him. But there are still some issues with Myers as well, because Myers also has certain add-ons that almost feel mandatory to run for you to be able to apply enough pressure early in the game. And also, the thing with D-tier killers is that they are also usually very map dependent. And if you get a map like Larice as Myers, you are hopefully going to have a good time, especially if you play with something like Scratch Mirror or even Tombstone. Because of all the line of sight blockers, all the close quarters you can surprise people in, it's really good for it. And stuff like Dead Dog's Saloon with Trapper, like we discussed earlier in the video. And next up, I wanted to discuss very briefly, as a section 2 of the video, what kind of changes the Trapper has gone through over the course of many years now. Trapper has unfortunately, though, had quite a few pauses in between some of his updates. Some of the changes that Trapper has received, though, is stuff like Trapper's setting speeds, you know, picking up traps, and also the base kit feature where he gets haste after he sets down a trap. But one crazy thing that many players may actually not know, since, you know, a lot of people just kind of keep surging in, you know, new players keep coming to Dead by Daylight, and a lot of players may not have played Dead by Daylight back when this was a thing. But one of the most insane things that survivors used to be able to do against Trapper is that they could sabotage his traps. That's correct, yeah, you could sabotage Trapper's traps and they would not come back. Like, that was actually one of the most insane features that this game had. Not to speak of the fact that back then Trapper just, you know, was significantly weaker overall. Back then, he could only carry one trap at a time. Because, but nowadays, the base kit is that he can carry 2 traps at a time, which is a nice base kit change, but back then it would just be 1. And another thing about the traps is that back then, traps would generally also spawn away from points of interest, like generators or like main buildings and stuff like that. They had a chance to spawn on the outer edges of the map or places where the Trapper had no reason to go. He would have to go out of his way, go into terrible places in the map, waste a lot of his time just to get a part of his power. He also used to be able to place traps like really close to each other, like the buffer size was very small. And also, one of the craziest things that Trapper could do, that a lot of people used, because, you know, that was one of the only things you could do as Trapper, because otherwise he was just weak, is that he could place traps underneath hooks. And that also included underneath hooked people. So what happened back in the days that if you unhooked a person, the unhooked person would just get trapped immediately. Because back then it wouldn't have mattered because there was no buffer time. This was very early on in the game, by the way. There was no buffer for survivors for like safety. So even if you got unhooked, you would immediately get trapped. And also about the hooks, other than that, other crazy fact is that Trapper could also simply just place a trap in front of the hooked person, which made it so that it was physically impossible, basically, for anyone to unhook the person, because they would have to disarm the trap first to be able to unhook them safely. Because back then, you could only unhook a survivor from in front of them. There was no other way. And because anti-camp wasn't a thing or anything, Trapper could just camp the hook. And that would kind of just be it. So the best thing you probably could do in that situation is just focus gens. There's not much you could have done about it, honestly. So now we are getting into the really exciting part of the video that we've been waiting for. So we are going to now be discussing the rework of Trapper and an idea of what me and some of my friends have had, what I think would be a really nice addition and to really spice up Trapper's gameplay and also for him to be more fun to verse. So, the first simple new effect that Trapper is going to have when you pick him. So, when you now pick Trapper, it will immediately apply a new effect that regardless of map you load into, there will be new kinds of visual blockers and grass, among other things, that will assist you. It'll be around in a lot of points of interest, you know, loops, tiles, sometimes windows, you know, all that kind of stuff. But maybe also still a little controlled, so it's not absolutely everywhere, because then it's going to be maybe a little too strong if there would be leaves and grass covering 100% of the ground. Now, we are getting into his power, the Bear Trap. Currently, the Bear Trap, I think, is a little uninspired and needs a lot of tweaking, a lot of adjustments. But I think with the correct adjustments, we can have something really amazing. The way that Bear Traps would now work is that traps would no longer immobilize you until you are freed as a survivor. and it would instead stun you for 1.25 seconds. After that said time, you are then, as a survivor, able to move at a significantly hindered rate. However, still, you are 20% hindered, but you are also still injured, but can remove the trap while you are moving, so this is also a new change. And the RNG of removing the trap, or the luck factor of removing the trap, has also been removed. And the flat time to remove a trap now is 3 seconds, but this can be adjusted with some add-ons that I also changed a little bit. Another survivor can also help you remove this trap, and the time is going to be a little less than you removing it by yourself. So that's definitely going to be helpful. However, you cannot do this action while you are moving with another survivor, so then you have to remain motionless for that to be. If the trap removal progress is interrupted by any means, regardless of what happens, the progression will start to regress very slowly until you continue it again, or until it goes back to 0. If you don't have a trap removed within the first 20 seconds of you being trapped, you will then be put into the down state. I think these changes will really help out because, it still allows for the survivor to do something. You can, every now and then removing the trap, all that kind of stuff, so you don't really have to worry about the trapper constantly interrupting the action, because a lot of the progress will be kept because it will regress relatively slowly. So I believe 20 seconds should be more than enough time for a survivor to be able to do something with the trap. That might sound a little concerning at first, because but then you may ask, what about interactions and all that kind of stuff? Well, don't worry, I have thought about that as well. So while a survivor is trapped and while able to move, they are able to slow vault windows and pallets. They are also able to drop pallets. They can unhook and heal people as well during that time, and they can also use items such as the flashlight. Trapper's traps will also now be darker by default, which also means that the tar bottle add-on was changed due to this base kit change. And now we're moving on to the actual base kit changes. One of the biggest changes that Trapper would receive on this rework is that he now spawns with all of the traps on his hand, and that is going to be the maximum carry capacity of however many traps there are in the trial. By the way, that feature can also be adjusted slightly. There will be at least one add-on where you can change the amount of traps that Trapper spawns with. As for other base kit changes, picking up traps will remain the same speed as it already is, relatively fast enough. Setting traps down now, however, is quite a bit faster, which also means that the Trapper Gloves add-on is going to be slightly readjusted to accommodate for the base kit change. Traps that are already on the ground that Trapper resets is also going to be a little bit faster. And the haste effect that Trapper now gets from placing a trap down or resetting a trap, its duration has been increased from 5 seconds to 7 seconds instead, which I think is going to help a little bit with catching up the survivors that just, like to pre-run when they hear you or see you setting down a trap around the loop. Personally, I think so far that all of these changes are really going to make Trapper infinitely more enjoyable to play as and also play against, since I think a lot of players feel like Trapper generally just isn't really all that entertaining to go against because, there's the unfortunate side effect that no one really likes going against the killer that, when you get trapped, you're usually just guaranteed to be down and then it's another hook state for the killer. Despite the fact on what tier Trapper is in, a lot of people share similar thoughts with a killer like Hag, because they are also a trap killer, so Trapper and Hag share similar features. Now let's very quickly go over Trapper's perks and what I would do about them. This is not going to be very long because I think only one of the perks needed an actual slight buff. So agitation and brutal strength would remain the same, as I think they are in a relatively fine spot and some killers do get some benefit from them. However, the perk I wanted to talk about, Trapper's final perk, Unnerving Presence. I feel like Unnerving Presence only really probably affects the very, very, very new players that don't really know how to do skill checks yet. But I think these changes will help the perk elevate it just ever so slightly without being too oppressive still. The last and final change and a new addition to Unnerving Presence that I made is that generator repair speed is now decreased by 1.5% for whoever is in the terror radius of Trapper. And I feel like this was just a nice little necessary change that doesn't really change too much. It doesn't really affect generator progression that much, but it might just help Trapper, gain that slight edge that he might need with that extra 1.5%. So without further ado, let's get straight into talking about the add-ons. So we are going straight from common add-ons all the way to ultra rare in that order. We're going to start with Bear Oil. So the new effect, Bear Oil, that is also the idea of my friend. Thank you, friend, for the idea. is that now with Bear Oil, setting a trap down will not immediately activate it, but it instead activates after a short amount of time it has been set down on the ground. Then we move on to Makeshift Wrap. A slight change that I've made to Makeshift Wrap, as this also is a slight theme add-on, is that when you get caught in your own trap, you will still not get caught. And the new effect is that you will also gain a 3% haste for 2 seconds. I think this is going to be a really nice thing, because I feel like a lot of the times I have seen some trappers run this add-on is that, you know, they do that kind of thing once, then, you know, survivors have it all figured out. They're not going to fall for that kind of stuff anymore. I feel like that 3% haste, even for just a few seconds, might actually really help Trapper to catch up to them and maybe get a hit on. Now moving on to Padded Jaws, and effect will now be another addition to, you know, maybe a meme category, is that the traps will no longer injure survivors. However, because of this, the hinder effect of the trap is increased by 10%, and once the trap has been removed by any means necessary, for example, survivor removing the trap by themselves, or the trapper hitting that person, making them injured, and then removing the trap, the hinder effect will linger for 5 seconds at 2.5%. Then we move on to Wax Break, and a very simple change I've made for this is that rescue and escape times of a trap has been increased by half a second. And there's also going to be another add-on that works along with this to increase the escape time just a little bit more. Then we got Lengthen Jaws, and this is a simple effect that whenever a survivor frees themselves from a trap, they will suffer from 15% hinder for 5 seconds. And also, at this point, it's important for me to note, like the graph says at the top, is that none of the hinder effects will stack along with each other, because that would, I think, make Trapper way too frustrating to play against, because then a lot of Trapper players would just combine a few hinder add-ons and then also get some hinder perks. Something like Forced Hesitation. It would not be fun to go against. So it will only take the highest value that you have and then use that as the hinder effect. Then moving on to fastening tools, and the changes I've made for this is that rescue and escape times increased by half a second, and survivors that are freed from a trap, again, by any means, whether by themselves or helped by another person, they will suffer from the mangled status for 30 seconds. Now getting into the slightly more actually interesting, into the higher tiers of add-ons, and what I discussed earlier, Power Battle's change now is that Trap's hinder effect will be further increased by 5%, and the time to escape a trap, though, however, has been reduced by half a second, so that's going to be like a nice trade-off. Trapper Bag receives a new effect and a new change that the maximum trap removal time has been reduced from 20 seconds to 13 seconds. Moving on to Honing Stone, which also gets a new effect, because I think Honing Stone was just a little too annoying to go against as a survivor, since, you know, you feed yourself from a trap and then you would just go down. The new effect of Honing Stone is that survivors who feed themselves from a trap will suffer from the broken status for 60 seconds. Good thing to point out that this only applies to when the survivor frees themselves. This will not apply if another survivor rescues that person from the trap, then the broken status will not apply to them. And then a change to Trapper Sack. This is just a very simple change, very similar to how Trapper Sack already functions in the game, is that it increases the amount of maximum traps that you have by 2. Now we're moving on to iridescent add-ons of Trapper, all the ultra rares, if you prefer to call them that. Iridescent Stone remains relatively the same, and the only change that it receives is that the time to reset a trap automatically has gone down from 30 seconds to 25 seconds. And then Bloody Coil. Bloody Coil receives a relatively large change, actually. It will no longer injure when you disarm a trap. Bloody Coil's new effect is that after a trap has been removed from a person, that survivor then who was hit by the trap will suffer from the incapacitated status effect for 20 seconds. And I wanted to add this incapacitated status effect, some kind of add-on, because not a lot of killers honestly have any kind of effect that makes survivors incapacitated now. And I think 20 seconds could just be good enough so that survivors might not be able to progress certain generators that are really close to being done when it would matter the most, and also making sure that it's not going to be really oppressive and last a really long time. So that about does it for this video idea of mine. I hope you guys enjoyed listening in on this. Remember that timestamps for everything in the video will be set down in the description below. I would love to hear what you guys think about this idea that I've had, and big credits to all of my friends who helped me out. Thank you guys very much for watching this video. Expect to see a video about a few killers coming in the next few weeks. Also going to continue working on this series after a brief pause once I've released a few other videos, and we are going to move straight into Faith after this. And this series, as you may have guessed by now, is that this series is going to cover every single killer in a similar fashion as the Trapper. Really hope you guys are excited. Thank you guys for watching this video, and I hope to hear from you guys. I will see you again on the next video.